Hey guys, so today we need to start talking a little bit about an institution that existed in the United States at her founding that some refer to as the original sin. This was the institution of slavery. Let's think about the word slave. At its root is Slav, S-L-A-V. The word slave comes from Slav, which is a type of person. The Slavic peoples live in Central and Eastern Europe. They speak Slavic languages. And by the 9th century AD or CE, take your preference, they had been essentially conquered and were enslaved by Muslims. Now, the Muslims didn't create slavery. This is a part of the human story, unfortunately, that goes back to the very beginning. Slavery existed in antiquity. You can look at the Greeks, they had slaves. You can look at the Romans as they expanded their giant empire. They conquered people and they enslaved a bunch of them. The Ottomans conquered people and they created whole slave armies. If we're going further into Asia, the Mongols conquered and enslaved and were enslaved. Going down into Africa, let's say Egypt. Who do you think built the pyramids? It wasn't aliens. Let's get over to the New World where there was no influence of any of these slavers from the Eastern Hemisphere. And what do you find? Complex civilizations like the Mayans and Aztecs enslaving other Native Americans. It's during the Age of Discovery that the slave trade becomes centered in Africa. As the Portuguese are exploring the coast of Africa, they are also taking over islands where they will plant sugar. They will expand colonies where a lot of sugar is planted. Sugar is a labor-intensive crop. Portugal is a small country that was not densely populated. They needed laborers. They needed slaves. These people were for sale in Africa because the slave trade had existed there, just like everywhere else. But because of the conditions of the Age of Discovery, because of the new technology, because of the expansion of empires, what's going to take place is the Portuguese are going to start buying people and people and people and people. The African kingdoms are going to make this a bigger and bigger and bigger trade. And it's just going to get tapped into by other European powers as they too expand around the world. And that's why when you're thinking about slavery via the history of the United States, you focus on Africa. The transatlantic slave trade is established, and the British eventually hook into that just like everyone else. Then, of course, you start to focus in on slavery and race, and freedom becomes color-coded. If you are free, you're most likely white. If you are slave, you are most likely black in these European colonies. Slavery is a global story, and unfortunately, it is part of human history. It has always been, and very, very sadly, it still exists. Slavery wasn't abolished in Mauritania until the 1980s, and owning another human being was not made into a criminal act until well into the 2000s in Mauritania, which means that there are lots of slaves still in Mauritania. There are literally millions of people currently working in bondage in countries like India, China, Pakistan. There's human trafficking that exists in Western countries like the United States. Predominantly, this affects women and children and involves the sex trade. But what I want to focus on right now is slavery as an institution in the United States as the United States was being born. Let's think for a second about the Declaration of Independence and what is the money line, the line that I think every American should actually just know by heart. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. All men, not some men. And by the way, men in this period means human. It's a universal word. All men, all people are created equal. This is the radical part of our revolution. This is the mind-blowing part. This is the part that shakes up the world. This is not how society has been run. We've had hierarchical societies, and now all of a sudden you're saying, wait, it doesn't matter if you're born into this great family or you're born a pauper. You have equal worth. Don't be confused. Worth is not about how much money you have in your bank account. It's about your innate worth as a human being. Why is it wrong to enslave you? It's wrong to enslave you because you're a person. you're part of humanity. You're created equal. Who has a right to enslave someone who is their peer? Some of the new states are able to see that there is intellectual dissonance between declaring the equality of mankind and having slaves within your country. Some of the states, like Vermont, abolished slavery from the get-go. Those dudes say, no, thank you, in the 1770s, before the war is even won. Then Massachusetts will follow shortly thereafter, even though it will take a while for all slavery to be phased out. That said, places in New England, places up north, were more societies with slaves. They weren't slave societies, which means their economic foundation was not built upon the slave labor model, as places like Virginia had started to be as early as the late 1600s. So what does that mean? In the northern states, you're able to kind of step back and think about this philosophy of all men are created equal. You know that it's wrong to make someone else less than. And hey, by the way, there are people who exist who are Black. Women like Phyllis Wheatley, who's an amazing poet, a scientist, Benjamin Banneker. There were Revolutionary War soldiers who had fought for freedom. You see these people and they don't look less than you. So they are probably equal to, let's live up to our ideals. In the South, where your money is tied to this concept of slaves as property, what you have to do is say to yourself, all men are created equal. Yes, that's true. But my slaves are not people. My slaves are property. It's not the same thing. This is chattel slavery, making the human into a thing that can be bought and sold like a cow. This is rationalization. And the founding fathers knew it. There's going to be a giant debate at the Constitutional Convention over slavery because we know it's wrong based on the principles that we have decided are right principles, are good principles, are objective truths. We do have founding fathers who owned slaves. Our greatest founding fathers, George Washington, who will free his slaves eventually upon his death, Thomas Jefferson, who has children with a slave, James Madison, big Virginian, a planter. These guys, their wealth was predicated on slavery. And while some of them actually thought that slavery would phase out, they didn't want to give up their money, their property. And that you can definitely criticize them for this. You can say, TJ, my good guy Jefferson, the person who penned the line, you are not really being faithful to your vision of civic virtue. And hey, by the way, There were some guys, though small number, of people in the South who also understood that you could not square the circle. You could not say that slaves weren't people. There's a guy named Robert Carter III in Virginia. He's sometimes called the Great Emancipator because he manumitted over 500 slaves. What does that mean? He gave them their freedom. He just said, all right, cool, I'm done. What did the other Virginians around him who owned slaves feel about that? He had to move north. We are, of course, going to look more in depth at slavery, how it impacted the formation of the early republic, how it turned into a bigger debate even past the founding era, how it becomes such a source of contention that the country gets ripped apart in the Civil War, why it is abolished finally, thankfully, legally abolished in 1865 via the 13th Amendment. Some of the legacies that come after that, I think, are important for you to contemplate if you're going to understand the country now, some of the issues that we have now. It's part of the dark past. There's no way around it. Having said that, I will also posit to you that I believe the seed for liberty, the seed for freedom, the seed for treating one another as equals actually was planted in 1776 with the ideals of the revolution. And that deserves some fireworks. I'll talk to you more later.